Hello, Frizzle fanatics! There is something about the writing of Brandon Sanderson that is just so uniquely him. Oftentimes, I love Brandon Sanderson books, and sometimes I hate them, but every single time I'm like, yeah, that one's a Brandon Sanderson book. And this creates an interesting problem and opportunity all at once, where if you've got that Brandon Sando bug, if you're craving his books but you've read them all and you don't know what else to read, but you want something that feels like Brandon Sanderson, it can be really hard to find something that feels like Brandon Sanderson, because like Brando Sando feels like Brando Sando, and nothing else can hold a candle to that very unique kind of style mishmash. But today I am embarking on the quest of recommending books that are similar to Brandon Sanderson. First, I asked my buddies and people on the internet, what do you like about Brandon Sanderson books? And these are the categories of answers that I got. And I'm going to recommend you books for each of these categories and mixes of them. Let me walk you through them. First, at the end of his books, there's like a Sanderlanche. There's an avalanche of action, of events happening, of all of this climactic things all happening in like the last 50 pages. And it feels so epic and sometimes overwhelming. And leading up to that Sanderlanche, there's quite tight pacing. It's not just at the end that it's awesome, it's throughout the book. Even if it's slower than the end, they are never meandering or really messy. Then we have the vibe of the power of friendship prevails. And this is kind of about two things. This is about strong friendships in his books, that there are really nice dynamics between heroes, but also just kind of like the tone of his book. We have characters with depression, we have worlds ending, we have characters dying, and not every single ending is 100% sunshine and rainbows. But even amongst the war crimes and systems of oppression and stuff, it still somehow feels happy and cozy. That with his books, you know that the heroes are going to win, and that you can be happy when it's all over. Next is the strong themes in his book, and I put leitmotifs here as a nod to music theory, which is kind of like the little themes that different characters get. Because in all of his books, there's a really strong thematic presence. You can see how certain character arcs very much line up with certain messages being delivered. And some of the most prevalent envelopes of these themes and leitmotifs that show up in his works are mental health and different characters dealing with different versions of those kind of struggles, and religion. Most of his books have interesting fantasy religions, and you have his characters, both believers and non-believers, that have these religions being important to their character and their plot. Then we have the feeling that the magic is a science and that the world has a real history. This is the rich, systematic world building that Brandon Sanderson does. I'm sure if you've ever read one of his books, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. And then we have our miscellaneous category, and for books that match equally in multiple of these categories. First up, we've got The Grace of Kings. And this one goes into magic is science and world is history, because it's very much an epic fantasy with very detailed and strong world building. I've heard this book described as silk punk, and I love that term. It's like cusp of the Industrial Revolution in a Chinese-inspired fantasy setting. If you like your fantasy novels long and dense, if you love it when a book spends pages describing how a magical contraption works, similar to like the bombs in Tress of the Emerald Sea, this book is for you. It's the first in a 4-book series. Next we have The Rarkyn's Familiar. And I could put this one in either Sanderlanche or The Power of Friendship, but I think it belongs a little bit more in Sanderlanche. Because boy, does this book have one. This is a book that I am currently obsessed with. I've already read it twice and I can't wait for its sequel. And this is about a girl who's like bent on this revenge quest, and she's trying to learn magic in order to be a better fighter, in order to take down the guy who killed her father. And she accidentally gets involved in like a summoning circle of this really angry demon, this Rarkyn, this birdman creature, and neither her nor this birdman are happy about this arrangement, so they decide to go on a quest together to try to find someone powerful enough to break their entanglement. And along the way, they find other power-hungry people causing trouble of their own and get involved in that. Next up is 6 of Crows. And there's kind of 2 reasons that this connects to Sanderson's work. The most important to me is the power of friendship prevails kind of vibe. This book has such strong character dynamics. We have 6 main characters, and you get the perspective over the course of these 2 books of all of them. And because the characters have such strong voice, it so works. I'm invested in every single one of these characters because they all have interesting internal conflicts, and they all also have interesting conflicts and relationships and support systems amongst the group. And another reason I think you might like this one is because if you enjoyed kind of the group of people going on a heist vibe of Mistborn, this book has that in spades. Next up is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn, Hardcastle. So this is the first one that I want to put in miscellaneous, because it does have a Sanderlanche, and it also has The Power of Friendship Prevails, and it also has good themes, and it also has magic is science, and it's a combination of all of those that I feel like makes this a perfect Brandon Sanderson read-alike. So this book has such an interesting premise where a guy wakes up with total amnesia, and he's at a 1920s secluded British manor, and then he finds out that he's in a time loop where he wakes up again every day of the same day. But then he also finds out that he's like a body snatcher, so every day he wakes up in the mind of someone new at this manor house. And he has a task that in order to get out of this terrible murderous time loop situation, he has to solve a murder. So if you're looking for a complicated magic system, look no further than trying to keep track of the time loop and plot points and which head is he in right now of this book. Next up, we have Rivers of London. And this gets to go into magic is science and the world is history. And I definitely liked it more than Grace of Kings, so we're gonna put it above it in that tier. It is about a police constable in London, and then he gets recruited a little bit Men in Black style to be a member of the magic police. And it turns out the Department of Magic Police is like super small. It's just one guy, and he might want to retire one day, so he has to train up his successor. And this magic is so much like a science, it's so satisfying. Like, it's literally the lore of the world that this magic system was developed by Sir Isaac Newton, and it feels like it. The plots of all the books in the series are also interesting magical murder mysteries that he's solving. Next, we have Project Hail Mary. And I think we're gonna put it right there in that tier, because this is a sci-fi book. Some science fiction books, the science feels more like magic. This science fiction book, the science is like real science. And this book could also very easily slide into the tiers of The Power of Friendship and The Sanderlanche, because it has it all. Astronaut wakes up with total amnesia, and then slowly he finds out that he's the only survivor on a mission that was sent out into the galaxy as a last Hail Mary. The Earth is undergoing like an apocalypse situation back there, and he's sent out to go try to find something that will help everyone. And then he also has to find out what that is as he's going. And the plot gets interesting and wacky and so fun. One of my goals when I was curating this list of books was to not include just the big bestsellers, because when you look on places like, for example, Reddit for book recommendations similar to Brandon Sanderson, you tend to get like the same 10 over and over, and those 10 are just like the popular fantasy books. So I wanted to include some books that were less popular, and I wanted to include some books that I didn't see getting mentioned as similar to Brandon Sanderson, but I feel like still share a resonance with his work, that if you like one, you'll like the other. Next up, we have The Wolf and the Woodsman. And this one belongs in themes and leitmotifs. The story is very Slavic mythology inspired, and it starts with a little village out in the middle of nowhere, and every year it is taxed by the big empire it's nearby. The life of one wolf woman, the life of one of their witches. And our protagonist, and she is the offering of the village that year. And this book follows her journey through the woods with her captor, the Woodsman, in their very tumultuous relationship that eventually becomes a romance. And this doesn't feel like a Sanderson book with pacing. Its pacing is not tight. It doesn't feel like a Sanderson book in the Power of Friendship kind of tone, because it gets more dark than that. But it does feel like Sanderson in the themes and interesting discussions around religion. Because in this book, there are like 3 different main religions. One that comes from 𝐂𝐸𝐄𝐄𝐏𝐿's pagan village, one that comes from the Woodman's faith, and one that is very Jewish coded, and all of these produce their own magic system. And the way that that's done feels so like intricate and raw and powerful and respectful to all of the religions involved. So if you're craving more of like a folkloric vibe and also way more exploration of like different religions in your fantasy, this is my recommendation to you. Then we have The Wheel of Time. And yes, this is an incredibly basic recommendation, but I feel like it must be said. The Wheel of Time books were in many ways an inspiration to Brandon Sanderson's own epic fantasy. And then the last 3 books of this series were written by Brandon Sanderson. In my opinion, those are kind of the best books of the series, where in this world, magic is very much on like a gender sex split. where if you're a woman, you can become a powerful sorceress, no problem. But if you're a man, handling the power will make you go crazy because the male side of the magic was corrupted hundreds of years ago. But here's the catch, the prophecy about the chosen one's gonna be a guy, so everyone's really worried about this because the guy chosen one is just gonna go into a murderous rampage when he goes crazy, right? And our main character is that chosen one as he starts learning magic and maybe starts going a little crazy. And that is the Wheel of Time series, starting with The Eye of the World. Next up, we have the Sandman Slim books. So these books definitely do not have the happy-go-lucky power of friendship prevails kind of feeling. They are dark and rugged. So if you're like, I like Brandon Sanderson books, but I want a little bit more of an edge and darkness to them, this is the series for you. This is a story about a guy who was imprisoned in hell for a decade as an assassin gladiator. And then when he gets out, he's a little lost in the world and keeps stumbling into all these apocalypses and kind of accidentally and sometimes on purpose solving them. And the themes of this book, the discussions it's having are so rich. Because our guy, he's suffering hardcore from PTSD. And though in the first few books, he's just kind of like dealing with things as they happen and not really actually dealing with his trauma on a deeper level, as the series goes on, that is more and more talked about. And honestly, this series, up through book 10, I do not recommend books 11 or 12, is so careful with its character arcs and with its plot arcs and with all of the things that it's thematically saying. Next up, we have Howl's Moving Castle. Have you ever seen the awesome, beautiful, magical Studio Ghibli movie? Yeah, that's based off of this book. The plot of this is that we have a teenage girl named Sophie, and she accidentally offends a witch who curses her to look like an old woman. So Sophie, deciding that she doesn't really belong at home anymore, sets out. And along the way, she kind of stumbles into becoming the housekeeper for a very feared and famous wizard named Howl, who lives in his moving castle. And one of the things that I adore about this book is how well it balances the feeling of being a fun adventure story for kids and how mature, specifically Sophie as a character, feels. It's such a cozy and fun story. Next up, we have the official Brandon Sanderson symbol for the 𝐂𝐸𝐍𝐻𝐿. Now, this is going to go into miscellaneous because this isn't a specific book, because he has written quite a lot of books. And if you're looking for something that feels like Brandon Sanderson, and there's a Brandon Sanderson book that you haven't read, which there probably is, then you should go out and find that one. All the 𝐂𝐸𝐍𝐻𝐿 books and all the non-𝐂𝐸𝐍𝐻 books. Next up, we have the Codex Alera series, starting with the book Furies of Calderon. And this one gets the Sanderland Tight Pacing badge. So this book's origin story is so fascinating, where the author was getting into a discussion with someone online. And that someone was arguing that the quality of the book was mostly down to its premise. If a book had a good premise, it was gonna be good. And the author of these books was arguing that no, even with a really weird, terrible idea, you can still make a great book. Where the author was provided two bad ideas and he made an awesome book series out of them. And the two bad ideas were the Lost Roman Legion and Pokemon. So in this series, we have a fantasy world where the magic system is like Pokemon, but the culture is like ancient Roman legions. And you know what? It works. It works really well, in fact. Then we have I Am Not a Serial Killer. One of the reasons that I definitely wanted this book on the tier list was because the author, Dan Wells. If you are a Brando Sando superfan, you've probably heard that name because it's one of his best friends and his new official writing buddy. They plan to be writing many more books together in the future. So if you're curious about the kinds of books that Dan Wells writes when he's on his own and not writing with Brandon Sanderson, here is a very nice selection for you. I Am Not a Serial Killer is a young adult horror book. The horror element isn't super strong and scary, so you can still enjoy this even if you're not like a horror books fan, but it's definitely a supernatural threat kind of book. Our protagonist here is a teenager who has all of the mental quirks of a serial killer, but he desperately doesn't want to be a serial killer, so he's made himself a list of rules. He's not allowed to stalk people, all those kind of things, but he's still really obsessed with serial killers. And then, in his small, snowy town, someone starts killing people, and to him, it really feels like a serial killer, so he can't help but start investigating. But as he's investigating these murders, he starts making this descent, where he starts breaking more and more of his rules, and a big part of the tension of this book is, one, not only is he going to catch this killer, but two, is he going to become a killer along the way? Next up, we have The Warded Man. I highly recommend the first book of the series. The rest of the series does go downhill from there, but the first book, definitely worth reading, and I think you can stop there. I'm putting this book under Sanderland, but it also very much belongs into magic equals science, world equals history, because the world building here is so strong. This is a world where monsters come out at night, and the only protection of them are these strong wards that you will put all around your house and stuff. And so this has transformed humanity, where it is incredibly dangerous to be on the road at night. And so everything has become very isolated, except this very specialized profession that has trained and gotten really good at making camp wards. And this has caused quite a large degradation of knowledge. And this book follows a few different people, oftentimes starting when they're kids, and it's done so well. And these people, our three narrators, are all kind of dealing with this loss of knowledge and threat of the monsters in their own ways. Next up, we have His Majesty's Dragon. And this gets to go into the power of friendship prevails, because these are such fun books and so much about this core friendship between our main dragon and our main human. So these books are like, what if it was the Napoleonic War, but also everyone had dragons as air forces? And our protagonist of these books is a naval ship captain. And then one day, him and his crew accidentally stumble across this dragon egg, and then it hatches and bonds to him. And now, whoops, he has to transfer to the Air Force because now he has to be a dragon rider, specifically with battles of the Napoleonic War and larger globe-trotting adventures. But the real core of this series is watching the awesome friendship between our main guy and his dragon named Temeraire. Last but certainly not least, we have The Curse of Chalion. And this one goes into themes and leitmotifs. This is a standalone book in an extended world called The World of the Five Gods, and most of the time, they stay out of people's business, but sometimes they get a meddling, and they do get a meddling in this book. So we've got strong themes and discussions about religion, check. But in this book, we also have strong themes and discussions about mental health, because our book starts with a character who has recently been through a grueling slavery, but he's managed to escape, and he's wandered back to his hometown, and he begs his old employer, like, please, just let me be like a lame secretary. And then his employer, quite impressed, makes him the secretary of like the princess of the entire kingdom. And then he gets entangled back into the politics that made him a slave in the first place. And this book very much deals with his feelings of trauma and being out of place and PTSD from all of this time he spent in horrific situations. And those are my 16 book recommendations for you today. I am planning on doing several sequels to this video because I have a list of book recommendations similar to Brandon Sanderson that's like 30 books long right now. And I would also like to hear your recommendations in the comments. Thanks for watching.